The moment I was reborn and opened my eyes, the dull ticking of the wall clock was the first thing to reach my ears. Above me was the all-too-familiar office ceiling, and the air carried the pungent mix of cheap instant coffee and printer ink cartridges. The electronic calendar on the desk displayed the date. Exactly 1 month remained until the global delivery of the Nebula Core underlying system, a project our department had spent 3 full years preparing. In my previous life, it was right after this point that my direct supervisor Richard, in the gentlest tone, committed the most treacherous acts. Under the guise of a group technical security review, he systematically edged me out of my leading R&D role. He tricked me into handing over all the underlying code architecture diagrams, then with a sweeping stroke of his pen on the patent application, erased my name and replaced it with his own. And I, after the system went live, was unceremoniously shown the door by him on grounds of failure to meet performance metrics, and even faced a coordinated blacklist across the industry, ultimately dying in despair. But now, the feeling of rebirth is so real. Glancing at the internal messaging window that popped up in the bottom right corner of my screen, the flashing avatar was none other than Richard's. "Come to my office for a moment, let's discuss the final review of the Nebula system." The message was word for word identical to the one from my previous life. I reached for the mouse, my fingertips steady without the slightest tremor, carrying even a hint of cold excitement. I quickly opened the underlying code repository on my computer and typed in a sequence of commands I knew by heart. In my previous life, the reason the Nebula system ran flawlessly was that I had embedded my proprietary physical parameter calibration logic into the 3 core dynamic compensation modules of the algorithm. This time, unlike last time, I didn't obediently write the complete logic into the public server. Instead, at the bottom layer of the core compiler, I added a logic dependency lock known only to me. This lock required no external attacks, no time bomb-style malicious code. Its logic was purely simple. The system compiled normally, passed test data without issue, and even performed flawlessly in small-scale simulated environments. But once the system connected to real-world high-concurrency external environments and lacked the physical calibration parameters I had to manually input, the entire core algorithm would, after running for exactly 72 hours, automatically trigger a deadlock and circuit-breaking mechanism. This circuit break was a failure of computational logic convergence at the physical layer. Any attempt to forcibly restart or modify the outer code would only cause the internal database retrieval structure to collapse in an instant, reducing it to an irreversible mess of garbled data. After doing all this, I casually cleared the local dynamic debugging logs, stood up, smoothed my professional suit, and pushed open the glass door to Richard's office. Richard sat in a wide leather office chair, holding a cup of steaming black coffee, a practiced and hypocritical smile on his face. "Have a seat, my friend." He gestured to the chair across from him, a barely perceptible gleam of calculation flashing in his eyes. "The Nebula project is about to enter its final phase. You're the backbone of the team, and I've seen all the hard work you've put in during this time." I complied and sat down, maintaining just the right look of weariness and humility on my face. "Richard, this is all my duty. I've finished deriving all the core algorithm modules." "Excellent." A sharp glint flickered in Richard's eyes as he patted the desk. "But as you know, this project is crucial to whether the group can secure the next round of massive funding from investor Sophia. Senior management places great emphasis on security and intellectual property ownership. To prevent any technology leaks, under the company's new regulations, starting today, you need to hand over all R&D permissions for the underlying code, to be uniformly reviewed and kept by me personally. By the way, for the core debugging next, you don't need to be involved the whole time. Go handle some peripheral documentation first." This was exactly like what happened in my previous life. Back then, when I heard this, I was filled with grievance and indignation, and I argued with him on the spot. As a result, I was labeled insubordinate and emotionally unstable, and conveniently stripped of all my access. This time, though, I simply lowered my eyes slightly, masking the fleeting trace of sarcasm beneath them. When I looked up, I wore a relieved expression. "Richard, you're right. The overwork lately has really taken a toll on my body. Since you're willing to personally take on the core review, I can finally hand off this heavy burden." Richard clearly hadn't expected me to agree so readily. He froze, a hint of suspicion flickering in his eyes, but it was quickly drowned by his desire to claim the credit. Eagerly, he pushed a permission handover agreement in front of me. In that case, sign this handover agreement. After you sign, transfer your main developer account access to my assistant. I reached for the agreement. It was filled with extremely harsh terms, requiring me to hand over all R&D control, while also committing that if any technical design flaws appeared in the system later, the original developer would bear joint liability. In my previous life, I fell into this exact trap. But this time, I had a contingency plan in place. I picked up the pen and decisively signed my name on the last page, but just above my signature, I seemingly absent-mindedly added a tiny line of supplementary text. Only the compiled code and peripheral interfaces currently uploaded to the public server are included in this handover. The underlying core physical calibration parameters and undisclosed algorithmic logic are not part of this transfer. Since the handwriting at the signature area overlapped, and Richard was at that moment basking in the thrill of soon claiming sole credit, he didn't even glance at it carefully. He snatched the agreement, stamped it with the department seal, and set it aside. Great! Richard flashed a victor's smile, as if already envisioning himself under the spotlight at the launch event. After you hand over the account, go write the peripheral user manual. Remember, without my permission, don't touch the core server again. Understood, Richard. With a smile, I stood up, gave a slight bow, and exited his office. Back at my desk, I watched as my account permissions were gradually stripped away. The system notified me I had lost modification access to the core code repository. However, Richard had no idea that what he took was nothing more than a hollow shell that looked impressive on the surface but had been rigged with a logic deadlock by me. He also had no idea that I was the only one in the entire company who knew how to input the unlock factor for that deadlock. I opened my private encrypted cloud drive, uploaded the photo of the handover agreement with the supplementary note I had just signed as evidence, and also created a tamper-proof blockchain hash timestamp certification for the code commit history. 3 days after the handover of permissions, a full department meeting was held to review the progress of the Nebula system. The conference room was packed, and Group Director Raymond made a rare personal appearance, seated at the very center of the main table. On his left sat Richard, looking spirited and sharp in a finely tailored suit, his face barely containing a smug sense of triumph. As for me, I was assigned to the far edge of the conference table, near the projector's exhaust vent, clutching an ordinary notebook meant to record progress on peripheral documentation tasks. Ladies and gentlemen, Raymond tapped the table, his low voice echoing through the quiet room. The Nebula project is our flagship launch for the market this year, directly tied to investor Sophia's confidence in us. I hear that the development of the core algorithm has come to a conclusion? Yes, Director Raymond. Richard grabbed the microphone before anyone else could speak, rising to his feet and projecting the presentation slides he had long prepared onto the massive screen. What appeared on the screen was none other than the core architectural logic diagram I had painstakingly derived through day and night of work. Yet, in the author attribution column, my name had been completely erased, replaced by Richard's 3 prominent English names. Under my personal leadership and full supervision, we have broken through the industry's 5-year computational bottleneck, Richard declared passionately, his tone brimming with unassailable authority. At present, the core algorithm has completed its initial logical loop, with benchmark scores over 3 times higher than comparable products on the market. All of this is a great victory achieved by our team under the guidance of my technical vision. A few veteran employees seated behind him glanced furtively at me, their eyes flashing with both anger and sympathy. At this moment in my previous life, I would have risen to my feet, unable to contain myself, publicly exposing his shameless theft, only to fall into the trap he had preset for disrupting team unity and envying leadership's achievements, and be reprimanded and ejected by Raymond on the spot. But this time, I just sat quietly in the corner, eyes lowered, fingers lightly scribbling in my notebook. I betrayed not a hint of anger, and even when Raymond's gaze swept over me, I gave a compliant nod. Quite inspiring to hear, Raymond nodded with satisfaction, though his eyes then narrowed with the caution typical of a capitalist. Richard, technical results matter, but accountability must be crystal clear. Sophia's investment terms include an extremely stringent breach clause if the system suffers any technical failure during its commercial demonstration after launch, or if intellectual property disputes arise, the person in charge bears extremely high internal management liability. At that moment, Richard was at the peak of his ambition, utterly deaf to any potential warning of risk. In his view, the code had run flawlessly in the test environment, all metrics looked astonishingly beautiful. This was undoubtedly a foolproof, massive political asset. Director Raymond, rest assured 100-fold. Richard slapped his chest, his voice booming. As the sole chief architect and full responsible party of the Nebula system, I have absolute confidence in the technical approach I led. I dare to put it in writing here, any technical detail, the system's ongoing stability, and the integrity of the code are all my responsibility alone, every bit of it, by me, Richard. Excellent, that's what I call accountability. Raymond finally broke into a smile and gestured to the legal staff nearby to bring out the prepared Project Technology Sole Responsibility and Liability Commitment Letter. In that case, to give the board and investors an explanation, just sign this commitment letter. Richard took the pen without hesitation, not even bothering to look closely at the specific liability ratios in the clauses, signed his name with a flourish, and firmly stamped his personal seal. I sat in the corner, watching the legal staff file the sealed commitment letter into the archive box, a faint, barely perceptible cold smile curling at the corner of my mouth. In my previous life, he had quietly shifted all technical risks onto me, leaving me to take the fall when things went wrong. In this life, driven by greed and arrogance, he had personally carved his name onto that liability statement leading straight to hell. After the routine meeting ended, colleagues filed out of the conference room one by one. Richard deliberately slowed his pace, and once most of the others had left, he walked over to my desk, looking down at me from above, his eyes filled with the contempt and condescension of a victor. "Hey, did you see that signature just now?" Richard lowered his voice, a hint of smugness and threat in his tone. "In this workplace, just burying your head in code won't get you anywhere. Only those who know how to control the big picture and turn resources into results get the last laugh. You're smart, you didn't cause me any trouble in front of Director Raymond today." "That's good." I was tidying up my belongings on the desk, looked up at him, and replied in an even tone, "Richard, congratulations on becoming the sole architect of the Nebula system. I hope you can hold that position steadily enough." "That's none of your concern," Richard sneered. "How's that peripheral manual of yours coming along? Remember, don't slack off on the small stuff. Also, to prevent core ideas from interfering with subsequent operational deployment, you don't need to attend the upcoming system debugging meetings." "No problem, I'll strictly follow your requirements and only handle the parts I'm responsible for," I responded calmly. After leaving the conference room, I walked straight back to my workstation. I turned on my computer and pulled up the company's internal document circulation system. Using my access rights, I downloaded the high-definition electronic scan of the Technology Sole Responsibility and Liability Commitment Letter that Richard had just signed. In this document, Richard stated in unequivocal terms, the core algorithms and architecture of the Nebula system were independently led and developed by me, without reliance on any undisclosed third-party logic or manual intervention by external specific individuals, and I bear absolute legal responsibility for the system's independent operational capability. I encrypted this file properly and saved it to my private secure email account. Over the next week, I completely withdrew from the core R&D group's daily communication channels. To further consolidate his absolute dominance, Richard quickly initiated a new round of personnel reshuffling within the department. He reassigned all of my core R&D performance metrics to several of his trusted subordinates, while secretly submitting a redundancy optimization proposal regarding me to the HR department. That afternoon, taking the opportunity to file peripheral technical documents in the company archive room, I stopped by the HR manager's office. The HR manager, named Victor, was on close personal terms with Richard, and the two had murky financial dealings in multiple departmental budget reimbursements. Seeing me walk in, Victor closed the office door, a professional yet icy smile on his face. "What can I do for you?" Victor leaned back in his chair, tapping his fingertips lightly on the desk. Victor, I'd like to confirm my quarterly performance review and the subsequent contract renewal arrangements, I said directly, my voice steady without any trace of emotion. A flicker of coldness passed through Victor's eyes. He pulled out a form and pushed it toward me. Since you brought it up, I won't beat around the bush. According to Director Richard's departmental assessment, your level of involvement in the later stages of the Nebula project was severely insufficient, and you failed to deliver the core deliverables on time. Considering the company's overall headcount costs and efficiency, we plan to terminate your labor contract after the project officially launches. In my previous life, Victor had used the exact same rhetoric, forcibly dismissing me under the pretext of capability mismatch after I had been stripped of my achievements. Even maliciously adding comments to my departure certificate that hindered my job prospects. This is Richard's decision, isn't it? I looked at him calmly. This is a comprehensive consideration by the department leadership and company management, Victor replied evasively, with an unyielding tone. But rest assured, the company will provide you with standard compensation, provided you don't cause any disruption to the project's normal progress before you leave, and you don't say anything out of turn externally. I understand. Unlike what he had anticipated, I didn't lose my composure, nor did I offer a single word of defense. I simply reached out, took the assessment form, and carefully read every qualitative indicator on it. The form clearly stated that I had not participated in the R&D and debugging of the Nebula system's core algorithms, and was only responsible for peripheral document organization. This was precisely the administrative trace Richard had left while monopolizing the credit. I can accept this arrangement, I said, looking up at Victor with a just right expression of compromise and helplessness. However, to avoid any subsequent labor arbitration disputes, I need a statement of work responsibility attribution and no outstanding handover matter signed and confirmed by Richard, certifying that all company assets and permissions currently held by me have been cleared, and that I have not retained any core R&D data. Hearing that I didn't intend to cause trouble, Victor immediately breathed a sigh of relief. In his view, as long as he could smoothly get rid of me without affecting Richard's fundraising, issuing a statement was hardly a big deal. No problem. I can have Richard sign it today and give it to you, Victor said with a smile. After obtaining the no outstanding handover matter statement bearing Richard's personal signature and the HR department's official seal, I returned to my workstation. Now, the traps at both the legal and administrative levels were fully in place. Next, I had to build an airtight chain of evidence. I opened the third-party evidence preservation platform app on my phone. This is a legal-grade evidence tool certified by the National Judicial Blockchain Nodes. Any uploaded data generates an immutable timestamp and hash value, carrying the highest level of judicial admissibility. I proceeded to preserve the following documents on the blockchain in sequence. First, high-resolution scans of all my original derivation manuscripts from developing the Nebula system, each page bearing the date and my unique personal marks from the time of writing. Second, all my email communications and chat records with Richard over the past 3 years, clearly showing the true timeline of the project from inception to every algorithmic breakthrough. Third, the financial transaction records from my personal account over the past 3 years for the project's core hardware testing equipment and third-party algorithm library licenses. On top of that, using the company's compliance reporting channel, I scheduled a notarized statement on the original ownership of the project's core algorithm to be automatically emailed to investor Sophia and her legal compliance team's official inbox exactly 2 hours after the global launch event began. After completing all this, as I watched the screen display preservation successful, hashcode generated, I slowly closed my eyes. The global launch event countdown stands at 24 hours. The 23rd floor of the entire R&D building blazed with light, the air thick with a near-manic blend of excitement and tension. Through the glass partition, Richard could be seen gesturing animatedly in his office, giving instructions to a few core confidants. His face bore an unhealthy flush from prolonged sleeplessness, but the swelling arrogance and greed in his eyes threatened to spill over. At exactly 8 o'clock in the evening, the phone on my desk rang. I picked it up, and Richard's impatient, commanding voice came through. "Come to my office. Now." I set down the phone, pulled an unsigned pen from my pocket, and walked toward that spacious office. Pushing open the door, I saw the sofas piled high with launch brochures bearing the group's logo, prominently featuring the headline Chief Architect, Richard, leading the next generation of intelligent computing revolution. Richard himself stood before the wide desk, atop which sat several delicate metal security boxes and the thick leather notebooks I had once used to record core derivations. "Richard, what do you need?" I stood before the desk, maintaining absolute restraint and coldness. Richard slowly approached me, his gaze carrying a condescending scrutiny and judgment. He reached out and patted the stack of leather notebooks, his voice low and oppressive. "Shawa, tomorrow is the globally live-streamed launch. Investor Sophia and Group Director Raymond will be watching from the VIP seats throughout. To ensure the project goes off without a hitch, and to fully enforce the group's commercial confidentiality agreement on core technology, I require you to hand over all physical manuscripts of the Nebula system." I raised an eyebrow. "All physical manuscripts?" "Exactly." Richard's voice jumped an octave, his eyes turning razor-sharp. "Including every draft notebook, algorithm logic derivation manuscript, and even the physical calibration parameter calculation sheets you left in your desk drawer over the past 3 years. Not to mention the hardware encryption dongle you use for local sandbox testing. Hand that over right now." I looked at him, feeling only cold disdain. In my previous life, he had forcibly confiscated all my physical manuscripts on the eve of the launch, then burned them to ash in the back stairwell trash bin late that night, completely severing the physical evidence I could have presented to the board afterward. He thought that as long as those papers bearing my handwriting and timestamps were gone, I could never prove those earth-shattering formulas were mine. "Richard, according to the company's standard R&D process, physical manuscripts fall under the individual researcher's development thinking and are kept by the researcher until the system is officially delivered." My voice was steady, as if stating an objective fact entirely unrelated to me. "Don't talk to me about standard processes." Richard slammed the desk hard, the last trace of pretense vanishing from his face, revealing its true menace. "I am the sole fully authorized lead on this project. And the chief architect appointed by the group. What I say is the process. You think I don't know what you're up to? You're keeping those paper manuscripts so you can blackmail me if technical issues arise later, or quietly sell them to a competitor." He leaned forward, his tone dripping with naked threat. "Shawa, don't say I didn't warn you. Your resignation agreement is still held by HR, and the comments on your exit evaluation are in my hands. If you don't hand over all physical traces today, wipe your local sandbox clean, I can have the legal department prosecute you now on the charge of suspected theft of the company's trade secrets, ruining your reputation in this industry for good and making it impossible for you to find another job for life." This hysterical threat would have suffocated and frightened the young me in a previous life. But now, looking at his greed-distorted face, I find it incredibly ridiculous. He's getting impatient. Although he sees the code and signed his name on every official document, deep down he knows better than anyone that he doesn't truly grasp the essence of that system. He fears those paper manuscripts falling into someone else's hands, and even more that someone might detect the impossible-to-understand clues hidden in those complex physical formulas. "Are you sure you want me to hand over all the physical manuscripts and hardware keys right now, and wipe all of my local development environments?" I look into his eyes and ask, each word deliberate. "Yes. Now. Immediately." Richard roars, "Not a single page can stay in your hands. After you hand them over, I will personally destroy them under strict confidentiality." "Okay." I don't hesitate in the slightest, not showing any trace of reluctance at all. In front of him, I pull out the hardware security dongle that holds the local sandbox control permissions from my pocket and place it firmly on his desk. Then, I pull the 3 thick tomes of calculation manuscripts, which record 3 full years of my hard work, from my briefcase. "Here they are, Richard." I look at him, my gaze as cold as ice or charcoal, all physical derivations, all parameter calculations, and the local keys. From now on, I will have no physical traces of the Nebula system in my hands. Richard looks at the manuscripts and keys on the desk, a flash of ecstasy and relief crossing his eyes. He can't wait and reaches out with both hands to cradle the stack of manuscripts, as if clasping the glory and wealth of the rest of his life. Smart of you. Richard regains his condescending arrogance, sneering and pointing to the door. Now you can go back to your station. Pack up your personal belongings, and after tomorrow's press conference I don't want to see you in the company again. I bow slightly, say nothing else, and turn to walk out of his office. Standing in the corridor, I look back through the glass and see Richard eagerly carrying those manuscripts toward the department's confidential shredder. He personally feeds the papers, which record the core algorithm's most fundamental logic, into the shredding mouth. The screeching roar of the shredder fills the air as the papers turn into indissoluble powder. He thinks he has destroyed my counterforce, the only hidden danger to his ascent. But he will never understand that what those physical manuscripts record isn't the backup code he imagines, but the sole physical calibration logic that allows the entire system to operate stably. And that logic has long since been sent to the shredder by his own greed. I return to my workstation, open the computer, and wipe all temporary caches and debugging environment variables in the local sandbox with a single click. The whole computer instantly returns to its original clean state. I pick up the coffee cup on the desk, pour the remaining remnants into the trash, then close the laptop and slip it into my backpack. At midnight, the lights in the R&D building were still glaring, but the air, once taut with tension, had fallen into an eerie silence. From the VIP reception room next door, the crisp pop of corks and bursts of hearty laughter occasionally drifted out. Richard was there, entertaining Sophia, the investor representative, and her accompanying team during their inspection visit. Through the half-open door, I could see Richard raising a glass of red wine, sycophantically toasting Sophia while rambling on about how he had innovatively solved the convergence problem of distributed computing power. I sat at my desk, which had already been cleared spotless, watching all this with calm detachment. Only a black bag remained on the desk, containing my personal belongings. The computer screen was dark, reflecting my expressionless face. I glanced down at my watch. 12:15 a.m. It was time. I stood up without drawing anyone's attention. The cronies Richard had cultivated were gathered around the reception door, waiting for orders, while the hard-working engineers slumped exhausted in their chairs, dozing off. No one came to say goodbye to me, not even a second glance. In everyone's eyes, I was just a marginalized failure about to be shown the door. I picked up my bag and walked straight to the HR office at the end of the hallway. The office was empty, but the resignation documents, already signed, were on the desk. I pulled out a pen and, on the final irrevocable confirmation of immediate termination of employment contract, firmly signed my name. I placed this document, along with my employee ID card, squarely in the center of HR Manager Victor's keyboard. Leaving the HR office, I returned to my desk and completely logged out of my personal accounts on the computer. Then, I opened the System Administrator terminal and entered the last system-level command I had as the original developer: clear the local sandbox test environment variables and revoke all unmounted underlying interface debugging keys. This wasn't sabotage, but standard compliance procedure for resignation. When a core developer leaves, clearing private debugging environments not officially deployed is perfectly legitimate and in line with the company's legal requirements. However, Richard had no idea that the physical manuals he forcibly took and destroyed that afternoon contained the dynamic calibration formulas for these debugging keys under real high concurrency conditions. The system he had deployed on the production server now was merely a zombie kernel missing those dynamic calibration parameters. After completing this, I unplugged the computer's power cable. I picked up my bag and turned toward the elevator. As the elevator doors slowly closed, I caught a final glimpse through the gap of the office where I had dedicated 3 years of my life. Richard's hearty laughter still faintly echoed from the reception room, accompanied by the crisp clink of crystal glasses. He was toasting his victory, yet oblivious to the cliff he was stumbling toward. Stepping out of the building, the cold night breeze brushed against my face, bringing an unprecedented sense of clarity and relief. Instead of going home, I headed to a 24-hour cafe directly across the street. I chose a seat by the window, ordered a cup of black coffee with no sugar, and placed my laptop on the table, opening it. I accessed my private encrypted email and performed a blockchain hash certification once again on the scanned copy of the resignation confirmation I had just signed, the record of the manual numbers destroyed by Richard, and the complete operation log of clearing the sandbox. This evidence forms a flawless closed loop. I have transferred all permissions, cleared all private environment variables as per the absolute instructions of company leadership, and received formal confirmation from HR and the department head before leaving. At exactly 9 o'clock in the morning, the bright red carpet had long been laid out in front of the technology building opposite. Interview cars from dozens of top global tech media had filled the parking lot, and the cameras, like long rifles, were all aimed at the main press conference hall on the building's third floor. I remained seated in the window seat of the cafe, where my black coffee had already become a second cup. On the laptop screen before me, this globally synchronized live stream hailed as an industrial computing revolution was playing. In the screen, the spotlight was dazzling. Group Chairman Raymond, wearing a subtly patterned suit, walked to the stage with a broad smile. In an extremely high-pitched voice, he announced to the global audience, "Today, we will witness a historic moment together. The Nebula system will completely overthrow the existing distributed computing architecture. And none of this would be possible without our group's most outstanding chief architect, Richard." Amidst the frenzied interweaving of applause and camera flashes, Richard, in a custom Italian suit, wore a confident and mysterious smile as he strode onto the center of the stage. He straightened the suit's button, bowing repeatedly to the investors Sophia and numerous industry bigwigs in the audience. "Thank you all," Richard's voice rang through the venue via top-tier speakers, also clearly drifting from my computer's headset. "Nebula is a brand-new algorithm that my team and I have developed over 3 years of countless all-nighters, with innovative originality. Today, I will demonstrate the world's first real-time high-concurrency physical data stress test." He walked to the high-end demonstration terminal off to the side of the podium, his eyes full of anticipation of reaching the pinnacle of his career. Under the focus of countless cameras, Richard gracefully extended his finger and slammed the enter key. On the enormous LED screen on the stage, an avalanche of dense code streams swept across. The system began to ingest data from tens of thousands of globally distributed nodes, and the back-end computing power chart surged upward at an astonishing speed. A chorus of gasps rose from the audience. Investor Sophia also smiled and nodded, and the accompanying staff around her were ready with signed contracts. Yet, sitting in the cafe, watching the rapidly rising power curve on the screen, a cold smile slowly curled at the corners of my mouth. I glanced at my watch. The system started, high-concurrency data input commenced, taking 2 minutes. In the absence of the physical calibration parameters I had left in the local sandbox, due to the data flow's high-speed convergence failing, the algorithm's internal dynamic compensation module would undergo a slight phase shift. This shift would be imperceptible in the initial minutes, but as concurrency accumulated, it would explode exponentially like an avalanche. The on-site demonstration dragged on for a full 8 minutes. Just as Richard spread his arms, ready to bask in the crowd's cheers and applause, the anomaly struck. The green power curve on the main screen, which had been rising smoothly, suddenly and without warning produced a glaring red, violent fluctuation. Immediately afterward, the entire demo terminal emitted a shrill alarm. What happened? The photographers in the audience erupted in commotion. Richard's smile froze in an instant. He pounced on the keyboard, fingers flying as he tried to quell the anomaly by forcing a restart of the logic module. However, he had no idea that the system's logical deadlock had already been triggered. Without the physical calibration parameters I had left in the local sandbox, any forced restart or peripheral code intervention would only accelerate the logical collapse of the internal database structure. The stream of code on the screen began to spiral completely out of control, as countless red fatal error, physical calibration logic loss messages sprayed across the entire massive display. Then, accompanied by a dull electronic crash sound, the entire system triggered a physical circuit breaker mechanism at the hardware level. The screen went pitch black, leaving only a glaring system deadlock alert. The venue fell into a deathly silence. Below the stage, investor Sophia's smile completely vanished, replaced by an icy, bone-chilling frost. Director Raymond's complexion shifted from ruddy to ashen in an instant, his eyes boring into Richard on stage as if he wanted to devour him alive. The reporter's camera flashes were no longer capturing success, they were like countless blades, frantically aimed at Richard, who stood helpless, his face drained of all color. Mr. Richard. What's going on here? Why did the system completely crash during a global live broadcast? Does this mean your nebula system is nothing but an immature technological scam? The reporter's sharp questions rang out clearly through the live microphones. Richard stood under the spotlight, veins bulging like thick ropes on his forehead, cold sweat pouring down like rain, soaking the expensive collar of his suit. His mouth was open, his lips trembling violently, but he couldn't utter a single coherent sentence. He didn't understand. He simply couldn't comprehend why code that ran flawlessly in the test environment would collapse so catastrophically the moment it connected to a real high-concurrency production environment. Just then, my phone on the table suddenly rang with a violent jolt. On the caller ID, Richard's English name flashed conspicuously. I stared at that frantically blinking name, unhurriedly picked up my coffee and took a sip, and only when the phone had rung for a full 15 seconds did I calmly slide to answer. Xiaohua. Where are you? What the hell did you do to the system? The voice on the other end was no longer the condescending tone of command from before, but the hysterical, frantic desperation of a cornered man, punctuated by gasps of sheer panic. Mr. Richard, mind your wording. My voice was calm, even carrying a hint of polite courtesy. I have no idea what you're talking about. Don't you play dumb with me. Richard roared in a lowered voice on the other end, the sound mixed with the sharp crack of a glass shattering against a wall. The system crashed. It's showing physical calibration logic loss. This must be your doing behind my back. I'm ordering you, right now, this instant, to send me the decryption code and physical parameters. Otherwise, you'll be sorry. Hearing him still resort to his habitual threats and coercion even at this point, I couldn't help but let out a low chuckle. Richard, I said calmly, gazing out the window at the chaotic scene in the building across from me, have you forgotten? Early this morning, I signed an irrevocable resignation agreement and officially left the company. Not only that, I reminded him, enunciating each word, last night, it was you who personally fed all my physical derivation manuscripts into the confidential shredder. And it was also you who forced me to wipe all development environments and keys from the local sandbox. These actions, your department's HR manager Victor and all your colleagues can bear witness. The ragged breathing on the other end suddenly paused, followed by the faint, chattering sound of Richard's teeth clenching in fury. And also, I continued, at last week's general meeting, in front of Group Director Raymond, you signed the technical exclusivity and responsibility commitment letter, declaring that the system was independently developed solely by you, without any reliance on third parties or manual intervention from specific external personnel. Do you remember that? You set me up. You scheming bitch, you set me up. Richard completely lost it, cursing wildly over the phone. Set you up? I let out a cold laugh, my tone instantly turning icy. Richard, taking credit for my work was your choice. Erasing my name was your choice. Forcing me to resign was your choice. Destroying the manuscript with your own hands was your choice. From start to finish, I simply followed all your demands. What do you want? Money? Recognition? I can give it to you. I'll change the chief architect's name back to yours. Please save me. Sophia is going to tear up the contract, and Raymond will kill me. His voice finally broke into a desperate, sobbing plea. Too late, Richard. I watched the live stream as Raymond, his face dark with fury, stormed the stage with his men and abruptly cut off the broadcast. The game has only just begun. Enjoy it while you can. With that, I mercilessly hung up the phone and permanently blocked the number. Within half an hour of the live broadcast being cut off, the entire tech building was already in complete chaos. I sat in the cafe, leaning against the bright floor-to-ceiling window, calmly watching the throngs of media reporters pouring out of the building across the street. Like sharks sensing blood, they clogged the building's entrances and exits. At around 10:30, I received an expected phone call. The number came from the private secretary of Raymond, the group's director. Ms. Chiawa, I'm Director Raymond's secretary. May I ask if you're available to come to the 12th conference room at the top of the building? The board needs to urgently hold a meeting regarding accountability and technical assessment for the nebula system failure. The secretary's voice carried an unmistakable edge of anxiety. I can come, I replied calmly. However, please allow me to bring my personal legal counsel. 10 minutes later, accompanied by my prearranged attorney, I pushed open the doors of that top-tier conference room, which was ordinarily accessible only to the group's core senior executives. The atmosphere inside was suffocatingly heavy. At the far end of the massive rosewood conference table, Raymond, the group director, sat with a face so grim it looked ready to drip with water, holding a long-extinguished cigar between his fingers. On his left side, investor Sophia and her legal compliance team sat at full alert, each wearing an expression of cold, ruthless business scrutiny. Seated at the lowest position was Richard, who had long since lost his former air of confidence. He was trembling all over, his once immaculately combed hair now sprawled in disarray, his suit and tie pulled askew, his gaze hollow and despairing. Beside him, HR manager Victor looked ashen-faced, beads of cold sweat covering his forehead. Seeing me walk in, Richard lunged to his feet like a drowning man grabbing at a lifeline, pointing at me and bellowing furiously, "Director Raymond. It's her. It was her." Richard's voice had become shrill and cracked from sheer panic. The system crashed because she maliciously deleted the core physical calibration code before leaving. This is occupational crime. This is corporate sabotage. Call the police and have her arrested. Watching his hysterical display, I didn't spare him even a glance. Instead, I calmly walked to the empty seat at the conference table, gracefully pulled out the chair, and sat down. My lawyer took a seat beside me and opened the briefcase. Richard, Raymond slammed his hand on the table, the thunderous sound shaking the entire room. "Shut your mouth. Haven't you embarrassed us enough?" Raymond turned his gaze to me, his eyes deep and imposing. "Chiawa, you're the original R&D personnel for the Nebula project. You saw what happened on site today. The system suffered a catastrophic physical burnout. Richard claims you poisoned the code and deleted the physical calibration logic. Do you have anything to say in your defense?" At these words, I smiled slightly and turned to look at my lawyer. Understanding my cue, my lawyer immediately pulled 3 stamped documents from the briefcase, one handed to Raymond, one to Sophia, and the last presented to the on-site legal representative. "Director Raymond, Ms. Sophia," I said in a clear, crisp voice that carried perfectly in the quiet conference room, "regarding Mr. Richard's accusations of malicious sabotage and occupational crime, we reserve the legal right to pursue defamation charges against him. But before that, I'd like to ask everyone to first review the 3 pieces of key evidence I've submitted." Raymond frowned and picked up the first document. "This first document," I said, tapping my finger on the table, "is the Technology Exclusivity Responsibility and Accountability Commitment Letter that Mr. Richard signed and stamped personally, in the presence of the group's legal counsel, at last week's all-staff meeting. In this letter, Mr. Richard assured the board of directors, in his capacity as the sole chief architect, that all core algorithms of the Nebula system were independently developed by him, and that the system possesses absolute autonomous operation capability, requiring no third-party or external manual intervention from any specific individual." As soon as these words were spoken, the blood drained from Richard's face in an instant. If the system, as Mr. Richard claims, was independently developed with no interference from others, I sneered, turning to look straight into Richard's trembling eyes, "then I have to ask, if the system you single-handedly created, requiring no assistance from anyone, crashed, why would it be me, a person with nothing to do with it, who deleted the code? Are you admitting that this commitment letter you signed is a deception to the board, admitting that you are not the sole architect at all?" I. Sweat streamed wildly down Richard's forehead and cheeks, his lips trembling violently, yet he couldn't utter a single complete sentence. He had fallen into a dead end he dug with his own hands. If he insisted that I deleted the core logic and caused the crash, he would be admitting with his own mouth that he was never the independent developer and that signing the commitment letter was commercial fraud. If he insisted he was the sole developer, he would have to bear the full catastrophic losses resulting from the system's design flaws alone. This second document, I gave him no chance to catch his breath, continuing to gesture for the lawyer to present the next piece of evidence, is the no-handover residual declaration signed by HR manager Victor and stamped with the company seal, along with my resignation confirmation letter. The documentation clearly records that before my departure, I followed Mr. Richard's absolute orders to surrender all permissions, clear the local sandbox debugging environment, and retain no company data whatsoever. The entire offboarding process was fully compliant and legal. Investor Sophia flipped through the documents, the coldness in her eyes gradually giving way to a hint of sarcasm. She looked up and swept a glance at Richard with a gaze reserved for something beneath contempt. As for the third document, my voice suddenly rose, carrying an unmistakable authority. It is the application to retrieve the surveillance footage of Mr. Richard, who, late last night, forcibly demanded that I surrender all my physics derivation manuscripts, and then personally destroyed them beside the department's confidential paper shredder, along with the hash values of my original manuscripts that I had pre-registered on the National Judicial Blockchain node. I stood up, planted both hands on the conference table, and looked down at Richard, whose face was ashen. Mr. Richard, the papers you shredded with your own hands yesterday were precisely the only derivation logic recording the system's physical parameter calibration under real high concurrency conditions. To monopolize the results, to keep me from blackmailing you, you fed the system's lifeline into the shredder with your own hands. What? Raymond looked at Richard in shock. No. That's not it. I didn't know those papers were that important. I thought they were just ordinary drafts. Richard completely broke down. He slumped off his chair and crashed to the floor, scrambling frantically to grab at Raymond's pant leg. Director Raymond. Please save me. She set me up. I really don't know how to write those formulas. You scumbag. Raymond kicked him away with one foot, and he trembled with anger. Enough. The investing partner Sophia, who had kept silent all along, suddenly spoke, her voice as cold as a surgical knife. She slowly stood up and slammed the contract on the table. Director Raymond, I already know exactly how things unfolded. Sophia looked at the farce with eyes filled with disgust. Your company not only brims with internal predation, technical fraud, and chaotic management on a highly important strategic project, but even let a complete buffoon who doesn't understand tech replace the real developers. Sophia turned her back and, when she looked at me, there was a note of respect and meaning in her eyes, but facing Raymond there was only cold, merciless business decisiveness. Based on your company's severe breach of contract and technical misrepresentation, I, on behalf of the investors, formally announce, we terminate all financing cooperation with your company. At the same time, we will strictly enforce the punitive clauses in the investment memorandum, pursuing on your company and the project's full person in charge, Richard, damages amounting to hundreds of millions. Ms. Sophia. Please wait. We can explain. Raymond's face changed dramatically, scrambling to salvage the situation. Yet Sophia paid him no heed. Escorted by bodyguards and lawyers, she left the conference room without looking back. The conference room was left in dead silence. Richard collapsed to the ground, his pant legs dampening with a trace of moisture from extreme fear. He stared blankly at the ceiling, knowing he was utterly finished. He had not only lost all his reputation, status, and wealth, but would also face enormous debts and legal accountability. I adjusted my suit collar, slightly bowing to Raymond. Director Raymond, if there are no other compliance checks you need me to cooperate with, I'll take my leave. After saying that, I turned around, with my lawyers by my side, stepped with determined strides, and walked out of the conference room that would completely wash away the humiliation I once endured. Behind me, Raymond's hysterical roar of rage and Richard's desperate wails echoed. On the third day after leaving the group's headquarters, the public opinion storm across the tech industry had escalated into a total disaster. I sat in my newly rented independent studio, with warm sunlight streaming through the window. On the computer screen in front of me, the latest financial news about my former employer was playing on a loop. Due to the catastrophic incident at the product launch and the high-profile withdrawal and massive compensation claims by investor Sophia, the group's stock price had evaporated by nearly two-thirds within just 48 hours. To stem the bleeding, Director Raymond was forced to hold an emergency press conference overnight, shifting all the blame onto Richard, claiming that all of this was Richard's personal commercial fraud and technological deception. However, this was nothing more than Raymond's wishful thinking of cutting off a limb to save the body. At exactly 10 o'clock, my attorney placed a certification document stamped with the official seal of the National Intellectual Property Administration on my desk. Ms. Xiaowa, the exclusive invention patent for the distributed computational power high concurrency physical dynamic compensation algorithm that you independently applied for has officially passed expedited review this morning and has been fully granted, the lawyer said with a smile. In other words, you not only hold the complete original copyright to the algorithm but also enjoy absolute exclusive patent protection over its underlying logic. I picked up the weighty patent certificate, a cold smirk curling at the corner of my mouth. In my previous life, Richard had abused his position to forcibly change the patent applicant to himself. But in this life, as early as the first week after my rebirth, I had used the unpublished original derivation process to complete a priority registration under my own independent personal name at the National Patent Office. Good, I said, looking at the lawyer. Proceed with the plan. Send the notice to the old group. Half an hour later, a patent infringement and immediate cessation of unauthorized use warning letter drafted by a top-tier law firm was delivered directly to the desks of Director Raymond and the acting CTO of the group. The content of the letter was extremely explicit, given that the group, without authorization, had forcibly run the underlying framework based on my personal patent on its production environment servers, and had caused a severe market incident due to unauthorized tampering with critical logic. I demanded that the group completely shut down all systems incorporating the algorithm within 2 hours and seal all relevant servers, or else face comprehensive patent infringement litigation and injunction applications. This warning letter completely severed any last glimmer of wishful thinking on the part of Richard and the group. According to my intel, in the 2 days since the press conference collapse, Richard had not given up struggling. Behind the board's back, he had used the department's remaining funds to secretly contact several well-known reverse engineering tech teams in the industry, attempting to violently reverse compile and crack the deadlock I had left behind, forcibly fixing the system to curry favor with Sophia. But he simply had no idea that the logical deadlock I had implemented was built on strict convergence of physical parameters. Without my patent authorization and calibration formulas, any reverse engineering attempt would not only be impossible but would directly trigger irreversible erasure of the underlying data. And now, this legally binding patent warning letter had directly sealed off all his escape routes from a legal standpoint. Any third-party team that had considered assisting Richard with reverse engineering, upon receiving a copy of the warning letter, unilaterally terminated their cooperation with Richard at the earliest opportunity to avoid being dragged into joint liability, and proactively sent me clarifications. At noon, a dramatic scene unfolded at the group's headquarters building. Due to the patent injunction I issued and the asset preservation requested by investor Sophia, court enforcement officers, cooperating with the Technical Supervision Agency, formally entered the group's data center and legally sealed and locked all servers carrying the Nebula system. This signaled that the Nebula project, which Richard single-handedly orchestrated and which consumed countless funds and resources of the company, had been given a death sentence. At this moment, Richard had completely become a lone wolf. He was confined in an office that had already been stripped of all permissions, banging frantically on a computer with no external network connection, trying to find any alternative algorithmic solution. But every technical forum and every code repository that touched the core module was annotated with my personal exclusive patent number. The day after the patent ban came down, the internal collapse within the old group turned into an uncontrollable avalanche. The whistleblower letter I had secretly submitted to the group's compliance department and external auditors before I left finally exploded with deadly force at this moment. Due to the devastating failure and massive losses of the Nebula project, Director Raymond, in order to account to the shareholders, had no choice but to order an independent third-party team to conduct a comprehensive and in-depth audit of the department's financial status over the past 3 years. This investigation directly revealed the tip of the iceberg of the crimes Richard had been hiding beneath a veneer of false prosperity. On the very first day the audit team moved in, they discovered that Richard had long been using the research and development name of the Nebula project to fabricate hundreds of hardware procurement contracts and third-party consulting services. Hidden behind those thick account books was a chain of collusion between him, HR manager Victor, and external supplier Victor. By setting up fake outsourcing companies, they secretly funneled the substantial R&D funds allocated by the company into money laundering accounts under their personal control. Not only that, but Richard had repeatedly withheld employees' overtime subsidies and performance bonuses, funneling them into his own private slush fund to purchase luxury goods and engage in high-risk personal stock speculation. Even more shocking, in a desperate attempt to meet the required number of R&D manuscripts before his departure, Richard had secretly accepted substantial kickbacks from senior executives of a competitor company, attempting to secretly sell off control of some non-core modules to an external company at a bargain price. These financial loopholes, originally tightly concealed by him, were uprooted one by the audit team after the Nebula project. Their fig leaf was stripped away. At exactly 3 o'clock in the afternoon, 2 vehicles marked with compliance audit and legal investigation insignias pulled up at the entrance of the group's building. Sitting in a cafe, I watched with my own eyes as the once arrogant HR manager Victor was escorted out of the building by several stern-faced legal and audit personnel. Victor's face was as white as paper, his body trembling so much he could barely walk steadily. His once pristine suit was now crumpled and disheveled, and he nearly stumbled and fell on the stairs. He had once believed that helping Richard coerce me into resigning and fabricate performance evaluations would secure his share of dirty money, never realizing that Richard had already dragged him into an abyss of irreversible crime. Meanwhile, in the president's office on the top floor of the building, a desperate Richard was making a final futile struggle. According to employees on site, when the audit team slammed the red-stamped financial anomaly certificates and bank transaction records in front of Richard, he lunged at them like a madman, trying to stuff the documents into his mouth. Hysterically begging Raymond, he attempted to pin all the financial loopholes on me, someone who had already resigned, shouting, "These accounts were all secretly drawn by that woman under the guise of R&D." But this time, no one would believe his lies. The audit team immediately produced the no outstanding handover statement I had signed before leaving and the fund approval signatures retained by the finance department. Every final signatory on the involved funds was, without exception, Richard's English name. The signatures he personally left on those fraudulent reimbursement forms had become the most unshakable nails pinning him to the criminal cross. Within less than half an hour, the police received an official report from the group's board of directors. A case involving tens of millions of yuan in embezzlement, commercial bribery, and false reimbursement was immediately filed. Law enforcement sealed off Richard's office, and his computer, personal safe, and all bank accounts under his name were legally seized. Once the arrogant and domineering figure in the department, who would constantly coerce and bribe employees, Richard completely lost all his dignity and pretense at this moment. As he watched stacks of illegal cash and forged official seals being pulled from his safe, he collapsed onto the floor, letting out a desperate whimper like a wounded beast. The court's final ruling came faster than expected. In a public hearing a month later, the old group produced hundreds of pages of financial audit reports and evidence of technical fraud. Once indomitable Richard, who had stood proudly at the podium during the press conference, now sat in the defendant's chair with a glaring prison guard vest, drooping his head. The judge declared in court, the defendant Richard was guilty of embezzlement, commercial fraud, and commercial bribery. Multiple offenses punished cumulatively, sentencing him to 15 years in prison, loss of political rights, and the confiscation of all personal property, with all illegal gains recovered. At the same time, the group's board announced the forced recall of all options and shares under his name, and his permanent inclusion on the industry blacklist. Standing in the corner of the courtroom gallery, I watched the heavy hammer fall with cold detachment. Richard seemed to be drained of all bones, collapsing like mud in the defendant's seat, muttering absent-mindedly with a hollow look. Yet his punishment did not end in the courtroom. While the judicial officers were escorting him to the prison, I, having learned of the news, arrived at the back of the court in the waiting passage, accompanied by my proxy attorney and 2 law enforcement officers. The moment he saw me, the one-eyed Richard suddenly seemed to go mad, wrenching away from the guards behind him and rushing toward me with all his might. His shackles clanged loudly in the cold corridor, and he toppled to his knees at my feet with a thud. "Little Lee! Little Lee! Please! Save me!" Richard lifted his gaunt, stubbled, tear-streaked face, his voice hoarse as if a wind instrument about to crack. "I know I was wrong. It's my greed that clouded my mind. It was wrong of me to steal your manuscript, to erase your name. Tell the judge what to say, explain to Sophia and Raymond, just say the code was a gift from you. Please save me, I can't serve 15 years in prison." He tried to reach out with his rusted hands to grab the hem of my pants, his eyes full of near-desperate pleading and entreaty. I stepped back half a pace, looking down at the man who had once sat atop and used all kinds of conspiracies to push me into a desperate situation. I felt not the slightest trace of sympathy, only bone-deep coldness and disgust in my eyes. "Richard," my voice was calm, echoing slowly through the empty corridor, "everything you are enduring today is by no one's coercion but your own. When you erased my name on the patent, when you signed the exclusive commitment at the meeting, when you shattered my manuscript in the dead of night, you should have understood you would face today. No. No. That was your trap. You enticed me into signing." He shook his head wildly, eyes swelling, wailing hysterically. "I have never trapped you," I slightly bowed, gazing at his bloodshot eyes, saying each word clearly. "I have given you countless chances to stop, but your greed and arrogance have driven you down the most vicious path every time. You didn't lose to me. You lost to your own bottomless greed." 2 officers stepped forward, unceremoniously lifting Richard's arms and dragging him up from the ground. "Let's go, 1072, don't raise a ruckus here." The officer's cold rebuke cut through the air. Richard was forcibly dragged toward the heavy iron door leading to the prison vehicle. He turned his head, gazing at me with a mix of endless remorse, despair, and fear, and as the iron door slammed shut with a resounding clang, his wail was completely cut off in the dark abyss. He took away 3 years from me. And the law and fate took away the latter half of his life. I turned and walked out of the trial building. Warm sunlight spilled over me, dispelling the last trace of gloom from my body. This feud and revenge spanning 2 lifetimes had finally drawn its cleanest, most decisive line at this moment.